Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is The Advocate, and today we are advocates for Should the Winds of Winter Be Split? And today I've got my good buddy, the Grease Goblins, on to help me discuss this topic.
Hi guys, we're always having a fun topic with the Winds of Winter.
Dude, it's always a fun time, miserable time too.
It's what the people want to hear about. We like our misery. That's all I've got to say at this point.
Oh, so much misery. So, Greece, before we discuss the topic in general of should the Winds of Winter be split, I think it's important to discuss all the happenings that happened yesterday on Sunday, December 15th, because, oh boy, it seemed like the internet blew up tremendously with yesterday's news. Did you hear about what happened with everything?
I did through you.
Oh my gosh.
We got definitely pump faked for all of our American football viewers. We got pump faked. That's all I'm gonna say. We had some good news followed by some tremendously bad news.
Yeah, it's funny how this seems to be a semi-annual occurrence. This pump fake. But yesterday, oh my gosh. So I got my hopes up and I mistakenly maybe Greece, did you get your hopes up when I sent you this or was it just me who kind of got myself up
There
into
was a little bit of optimism, but I was like, it's like Euron with his poison gifts. That's where I was at. There was just like a manner of just like something doesn't seem right here. We don't get things like this in this community. Yeah. So I was like, there was some cautious optimism, but at the same time, there was also like, I don't know. Well, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, keyword here being cautious. But anywho, so yesterday there was a big bunch of hoopla on Reddit because Shawn Speakman, who works within the publishing industry, he had allegedly spoken with George R.R. Martin's editor Anne Groell and received information, again, all alleged, from Anne Groell that George R.R. Martin had completed enough pages necessary to be bound by a full-length volume Winds of Winter book. So immediately from there, it kind of became a game of telephone where Shawn Speakman spoke to someone who was a YouTuber, and that YouTuber then passed off the information to another YouTuber who happens to have a podcast. That person put it on their podcast, and that information somehow got disseminated onto Reddit, and then Redditors went wild with that. So it kind of became a game of telephone where Shawn Speakman said one thing, and at the very end of the telephone line, someone had heard that, oh, Shawn Speakman said that George R.R. Martin had turned in a manuscript for the Winds of Winter, and Shawn Speakman is in the know about this. Well, Shawn Speakman then immediately came at the end of the day to lay those rumors to rest and basically cease whatever rumoring was going on. So these are the words from Shawn Speakman himself. And he says, "Hi everyone, my information is purely speculative based on the amount of manuscript pages George has said on his Not a Blog and on Colbert Show he's completed and how many pages a book can physically contain within a binding. I have not spoken to George in at least 2 years, and while I talk to his editor fairly often due to my work with Terry Brooks, we rarely discuss George and how his writing is going. While I admire the YouTuber's enthusiasm, he took my words and meaning out of context. And if I knew something beyond what I said above, I certainly would never share it as it is not my news to reveal. Hope this clears up the confusion and along with it, the DMs I'm receiving." And Greece, oh man, I let myself get carried away. I don't know. What were your thoughts when you heard the news yesterday that Shawn Speakman allegedly had information that George R. R. Martin had enough pages to fill The Winds of Winter book?
So I was a bit surprised because that seemed very contradictory to all the information that's been out about it. And so that's why, like, when you asked me, I was very cautiously optimistic. Like there was enough reasonable doubt into me to where I didn't fully believe it, especially because George himself hasn't said anything about it.
Yeah.
For me, anything Winds of Winter is, if it doesn't come from George himself or there's no alluding to it by George, then I kind of take it with a grain of salt. And you think about the way the community has wanted this book for so long. It's one of the most anticipated books, of all time. Things like this is going to happen. Now, I will say, as I've kind of been contemplating this and you reading it and stuff, I do think there could be maybe a grain of truth in here that, like, maybe he's a little further along than we thought, or maybe he's thinking about, or maybe the editors, people around
Yeah.
him are thinking about, maybe we should split the book because I don't know how we come to this conclusion that, YouTubers, had, or and he says in his own words that was taken out of context in his own words. Seems like a very far cry if he didn't allude to any of those things whatsoever. So there is some of this that I think is interesting because it seems like we somehow got very far away from the truth within only a couple of people interacting with this conversation. So either the people that did the reporting on this maybe didn't do the best job, or maybe the person was a little bit more misleading. There's a lot in here. It's a gray area
Right.
because we don't have private DMs as much from both of these people or what they were talking about specifically. It's almost hearsay, but
Yeah.
that's my overall thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I do think that Sean Speakman was he was genuinely speaking from a place of truth, but not from any truth that from any insider information that he had, but from truth from maybe previous conversations that he had with George R. R. Martin's editor, and based on his own personal speculative knowledge that he has. I think, you know, he may have had conversations in the past with Anne Growell, George R. R. Martin's editor, about George's writing progress, but the information that Anne Growell relayed to Sean Speakman was the information that has already been made public, which is that George R. R. Martin has written 1,100 pages, and to many people, that would be enough to publish a full length novel, but not enough for George to publish The
Yep.
Winds of Winter. And even if it was enough to publish, so let's say theoretically, you know, Sean Speakman was, and, what Sean Speakman allegedly said or what he actually said, let's say that what Sean Speakman allegedly said, which is that he is either at the amount or nearly at the amount for George R. R. Martin's editors and publishers to be wanting George to split the Winds of Winter book. If that is indeed true, then George R. R. Martin must be close to the 1,500 manuscript page mark that a lot of publishers and editors would be wanting to split the book and have a separate, another Winds of Winter book that takes place someplace in the future. However, even if he had that amount of pages completed, you know, 1,500 manuscript pages doesn't mean a Winds of Winter book. It just means a lot of pages written, but it doesn't,
Yep.
he could have like
Hmm.
Cersei chapters, Tyrion chapters, and Arya chapters completed, whereas he's far behind on some other chapters. Or maybe he's got like, oh, I've got Cersei's ending and I've got Cersei's, beginning, but I don't really have her middle chapters. So although he has theoretically the amount of pages necessary for a The Winds of Winter book, it's not enough to make a cohesive The Winds of Winter book.
Agreed. Or it's, the situation where you don't have all the pages you want to get to an ending that you want for the book.
Yeah.
And you run into the situation that we have with Dance, where Dance is not a complete story, in my opinion. Like, of the 5 books, it is the book that is the least complete in terms of a natural conclusion.
Yeah.
And that would apply Winds of Winter 2 as well. If we, just split the book here, or we just had whatever he has, because naturally he's going to be further along with certain characters than others. And so maybe we would go back to a situation where, Feast for Crows, we come out and we see half of our POVs and we don't see the other half until the next book. Or maybe we do see some of those, but we only see a little bit of them. So, like how Dance with Dragons only had 2 Cersei chapters, after Feast for Crows, she was the main POV. That could be similar here, where it's like, okay, well, George has 2 brand chapters. So we have 2 brand chapters in Winds of Winter, and then we don't see him again. And he comes back in the next book because he hadn't written those out yet.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, that makes complete sense. George R. R. Martin could have most characters, three-fourths complete, but not entirely complete. And so he would then need to, write additional chapters that would then take place in a part 2 of The Winds of Winter, kind of similar to, as you said, what happened with A Dance with Dragons to A Feast for Crows. So all the hoopla that happened yesterday kind of leads us to our predominant topic here today, which Greece. Do you think The Winds of Winter should be split?
If we want it out relatively soon, yes. And the problem is, I think the issue is George has said multiple times he wants it to end with 7 books. He wants it to be Winds of Winter, Dream of Spring.
Yeah.
But, as we've discussed, even on my channel with Winds of Winter predictions, that just doesn't seem to be the most feasible thing in the world at the moment. So, how does he do that? I think splitting the book could really, help him. It could, maybe please the fan base because we were getting some more
Oh,
work
yeah.
from him. It could please the publishers, maybe get some pressure off of his back. And so I think from a standpoint of the expectations of the general audience, the general public from
Yeah.
him, I think it would help in that sense. The sense that I don't think it would help and why I don't think George would necessarily be happy with it is we would run into the same situation is, either you have to do it 2 ways. There's only 2 ways you can do it if you're going to split it. One is you're going to do what you did with A Feast for Crows and Dance Dragons is you're going to take some of the plot lines, you're going to have it be part of this book, some of the plot lines will be part of the next book. So that could be part of it. Now that was not well received. I know like in the fan base now, much more accepting of it, but in terms of how I've seen more casual people that have maybe only read the books once or maybe twice, it wasn't received the best. One of the things that I really pointed out in my Feast for Crows retrospective is how jarring it is to go from Storm of Swords to Feast because you walk into so many plot lines where the first 4 chapters of the book, I mean, not a single one of those POVs or POV in the first book,
Yeah.
or not the first book, the third book. So it would be different here, of course, because George isn't going to add new POVs. It's what he said anyway, outside of the prologue, epilogue, I would assume. But yeah, I don't know. So you'd have either that situation or you'd have a situation where you're trying to figure out what is a midpoint of the Winds of Winter normally, right? So where would we be at the middle of the book? And that's where it becomes okay, does George think he has a good middle spot to end the books, or end Winds of Winter specifically? And that's tough because that comes down to what George has planned. Some plot lines that might work really well for Daenerys. She seems to have 2 different arcs in the Winds of Winter coming up, which would be her Dothraki arc, and then the falling out of the Marine, the Slaver's Base stuff, and the rest of the Essos stuff. So for a character like her, it might work really well if that was to be the case. But for others, I mean, maybe that wouldn't work nearly as well. And it also comes down to how much time do you need for each character, right? Can you get to the half point mark while only having a certain amount of chapters for each character? So I think in a perfect world, the answer would be yes, he should split it. I think it's much harder to do that, given what George wants to do.
Yeah.
I personally do think, though, he should probably split them.
Yeah.
Just given the fact that he has way too much material still left to do and how he's been focusing on more world building and things like that, I think having an extra book would help him. But what do you think about that, JC?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything you just said. To your first statement, I think if George wants to release a book, I think he's just going to have to split it. There's way too much information that needs to happen within the book. Even before we learned about yesterday's news, Grease, you and I were already of the opinion that, George R. R. Martin has gardened this book so much to a point where he's got, just bushes and bushes everywhere, these huge plants, trees growing everywhere, brambles on those trees, roots. It's like, all right, George, you've gardened as much as you've gardened. Realistically, how are you going to trim this garden back to a point where you can conclusively and satisfactorily end this series within just 2 more books? I've always been skeptical of that. Grease, it seemed like you were skeptical of that as well. Is that correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
very skeptical.
Yeah. So it just seemed like it was already a foregone conclusion that George would need more than 2 more books in order to conclusively resolve this series. So with that said, I think the fans, especially us hardcore fans, if George R. R. Martin were to split the Winds of Winter, I think would be like, yeah, heck yeah, just give us something, please. It's been 14 years since the Dance with Dragons. We're starved for new material. We're starved for information. Please just give us something. We don't care if it's half what you wanted. Just give it to us. The casual audiences might kind of, not like it as much, but at this point, I think I just, I'd be grateful for something even as Dance with Dragons is my least favorite book in the series. Even if this is just another Dance with
Same.
Dragons, I'd be grateful. I'd be like, yes, please, thank you. um, so to that, I do think the Winds of Winter should be split. However, Grease, both you and I are of the opinion that we would prefer a chronological split as opposed to a character split, kind of what happened with A Feast for Crows and A Dance of Dragons.
Yes.
And unfortunately for us, George R. R. Martin, his writing style is that he writes one character at a time. He writes as many chapters as he can for one particular character before moving on to another character. And that does not kind of fall in line with writing a chronological story where he's writing, hey, this is what happened in Arya's point of view. All right, next in the chronology, Sansa's over here, at the Vale doing this. Let me write a Sansa POV. Now let me write, a Jaime Lannister POV. It doesn't work like that. He writes certain characters at a time. So while, George may potentially have, Arya, Tyrion, and potentially Cersei chapters near completion, he might be really far behind on Daenerys or Brienne of Tarth or just other characters that he hasn't really spoken of. So all this to say, if a split were to happen with this book with Winds of Winter, I think it would be another character split that like what happened with Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons and not a chronological split.
Agreed. I will say, Dance of the Dragons is kind of catching some strays in this video. I will say, I still really like Dance of
Oh
Dragons.
yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
just, it is like to your point, it is also my least favorite book of the five for a number of reasons. But boy, Theon holds that book up.
Oh yeah,
But
for
yeah,
sure. Theon's the backbone of that book. Theon in the North. The North is so
yes,
good. And A Dance with Dragons, as you said, A Dance with Dragons is still a good book. Like we still enjoyed A Dance with Dragons. It's just compared to the super high standards that were set with the prior books, especially the first three books of the series. A
yep,
Dance with Dragons just kind of is a little bit short, there compared to the greatness there. But we would still, even if The Winds of Winter is another A Dance with Dragons, we would still be happy just to have the continuation of the
yep,
story. So,
agreed.
so if a split were to happen, and George R. R. Martin were to decide to do a character split similar to A Feast for Crows and A Dance of Dragons, where where in the timeline would obviously we're only going to get the story for half the characters. Where in the timeline theoretically do you think these characters will end their stories on? Do you think we're going to get to a point in the story where we see, you know, Aegon slash Fagon's coronation? If John Connington is in this theoretical Winds of Winter Part 1, do you think we're going to get to, Daenerys finally arriving into Westeros in this theoretical Part 1? What do you think, Reese?
So it would have to be a scenario where, again, if we're going with the idea that it's like a parallel feast for dance comparison,
Hmm.
you basically have to have where do you believe all these characters are going to end to get into the last book, or at least leave like a little bit of wiggle room so there's a chapter or two that that character can have towards the second half of part two of Winds of Winter. So, like for instance, the characters we've talked about that we think are probably closer to being done, like Cersei, for instance, I would expect her leaving King's Landing would be a natural point of ending for the first part, and then the second part we would get whether it's her journey to Casterly Rock or maybe a chapter or two in Casterly Rock,
Yeah.
or characters like young Griff, like you talked about. I would definitely think young Griff's coronation would be the end point of a part one, and then in a part two, maybe we see a chapter or two of his actual reign. I think Daenerys and Bran would definitely be part two. I don't think we would see them in part one, or maybe if we did, it would be much more minor extent, maybe a couple chapters,
Yeah.
and then they would kind of not be there as much because I think those are two the plot lines he doesn't have done. I think the main stuff to look at of to predict what we would see in the next book would be what stuff did he have to finish from A Dance with Dragons. So the plot lines like Stannis's plot line, the Battle of Ice, the Battle of Fire. So some of the Tyrion stuff, some of the Barristan stuff, Victarion stuff, um, some of that stuff. So I think we would see just normally like if you want to just watch Winds of Winter predictions, which we could go on forever. It's wherever you normally would think Winds of Winter would end for all these characters, but you just have to figure out which characters you think are actually going to be in the part one.
Right.
So that's going to be the issue. And the part this would be the really big problem is if you say have your favorite character is Sansa or whoever, and you don't get them in part one, I mean, you're going to be waiting probably another at least after these books. Let's say he has some of it done for part two, but expect at least another 5 years, 7. Like
Oh yeah.
it could be at least 20 years before you even see a character after Dance with Dragons.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I mean, I wasn't a I wasn't a fan or even, probably of appropriate age to read this series in 2005 when A Feast for Crows was released, but I can imagine that people back in 2005 when they read A Feast for Crows and they finished it, they're like, "What the hell? Where's Jon Snow? Where's Stannis?" And then they then had to learn that like, "Oh, those characters are being held off to a future book." A book that they would then have to wait 6 years until 2011 to finally read up on. I can imagine just how infuriating that must be. So if we get The Winds of Winter Part 1 book with only half the characters, and let's say, as you said, your favorite character is Daenerys or Sansa or, someone along those lines, and they're not in this part one. You're like, what the hell? Now I have to wait for a part two. And, realistically, will George be able to write a part two? Like,
Yeah, that's a big question.
yeah. Oh boy, I don't know. Um, so yeah, that is infuriating. I will say to your point about the battles, that is one thing that I am grateful for. If a character split were to happen, at least we have, the Battle of Fire and the Battle of Ice that will take place within the first, fourth of the next book.
Yes.
You, like just having those battles at the beginning of the book, oh man, like even like I can't speak to, this theoretical part one that has not happened, but if that were to happen, at least we have those battles to look forward to. At least we have that to get us pumped up about like, oh man, like, oh, the wait. Well, the wait is probably not worth, nothing is worth 14 years, but this at least helps soften the pain a little bit of that wait, that we finally have
Yes.
answers. We finally have a battle. We finally have a continuation of the story taking place where we have answers to definitely not all and definitely not most, but a few of the questions that we had leaving A Dance with Dragons and going into The Winds of Winter.
I agree. One thing I will say on the Feast for Crows comparison, Feast for Crows, I think that's one of the biggest issues and why I think a lot of people, if you're gonna ask like a casual fan base, Feast for Crows is probably the least favorite book of the series. I don't think Winds of Winter would necessarily have that bad of a problem, just because Feast for Crows introduced a lot of new plot lines. A Feast for Crows is very much a book that was looking to expand, the world, introducing new plot lines, which a lot of those like minor plot lines I really like. Winds of Winter should not have that focus whatsoever. Winds of Winter should be, we have our main POVs that have been set up that we need to get going.
Yeah.
The Stannis, so Asha Theon plot, the John Connington plot, the Barristan plot, the Tyrion plot, whether we're gonna have Jon Snow's plotline in this as well. So Melisandre, it shouldn't be as a drastic difference because the thing with Feast for Crows and Dance is most people's favorite characters are those main three, are Dany, Tyrion, Jon.
Yeah.
Especially if you're looking at more of a casual audience, people that don't go as in depth. Those are the figureheads of the series, right? The show figured that out. The book's not that much different. So, I don't think it'll be that drastically different because I think you'll see at least some of your favorite characters in each of the books in terms of that difference in Feast and Dance.
Yeah. No, agreed. And, to your point, the benefit with the Winds of Winter is that unlike A Feast for Crows, where George R.R. Martin introduced quite a few new POV characters that people were not familiar with, the very first, once we get past the prologue, the very first chapter, you see the prophet and you're like, who the hell's the prophet? It's like Aaron
Yep.
Damphair, this one character that appeared in this one Clash of Kings chapter. And then Captain of the Guards, you're like, who's Ario Hota? You know, there's a lot of just kind of apprehension with new readers when they read these new POV perspectives that they didn't really have much information on prior to A Feast for Crows. The benefit with The Winds of Winter is that George R. R. Martin, words are wind, but up to this point, George R. R. Martin has stated that he has no intention of introducing new POV characters. The characters that we already have, those are the ones we're stuck with for the rest of the series. So at least we have that to look forward to, where the characters that we will be reading up in the next few installments of the series will be characters that we are already intimately familiar with.
Agreed. That
Yeah.
should be a strength of the book.
Yeah, for sure. So obviously, we both are in agreement that I think a Winds of Winter split will inevitably happen. We do think that if a split were to happen, it's going to be based on characters, and the end point for half these characters in Winds of Winter Part 1 will be the end point that they would have had George R. R. Martin wanted to publish a 2,400 page Winds of Winter book. It's just going to be for those specific characters. So, given this information, Grease, given the potentially realistic scenario where we do see a split the Winds of Winter book, when the magic question, what year, when could you theoretically see this Winds of Winter Part 1 be released?
So it would have to come at a point where either George has finally just come to this conclusion where he can't finish it in one book, or God forbid, there's some sort of health issue that George has that he,
Oh yeah.
realizes, okay, maybe I should just, drop this and let's get the ball rolling. Or maybe the publishers put more pressure on him. I don't know how you could put more pressure on him at this point,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
maybe, that just gets to him. Maybe there's a legit conversation that happens between editors, people close to George about breaking the book up, if that hasn't happened already. And so I don't see this happening relatively soon. I remember the first time I predicted this, I said, like in my first Winds of Winter prediction video, in terms of predicting the book's release, I said 2025. That's not aged well. So I don't know at this point. I mean, maybe 2028, 2029.
Oh man.
I have felt less and less optimistic on predicting it because George himself has not been optimistic about the book. He's given zero indication within the last couple years. Even when we were talking about this on live stream over the weekend, JC brought up a chart, and it just doesn't seem like he's writing the book at all. Or if he is, it's a very limited capacity.
Yeah.
Something would have to change that is dramatic within that, the next couple years for it to be released relatively soon. By relatively soon, I mean within the next 3 years. Something would have to happen that would drastically change his opinions on Winds of Winter, because so far he's given literally no even slight indication of splitting the book, of doing anything that we've talked about in today's video. This just seems like the realistic approach that George hasn't really talked about too much yet.
Yeah. As you mentioned earlier, George has been adamant about wanting this series to be wrapped up in 7 books. And, the reasoning for that is, it's symbolic about the 7 gods, the all the references to the number 7 within this series. He has wanted to wrap this series up within 7 books. So he's been married to this idea that it has to be done in 7 books. 2 more books is all I'm gonna need, and I'm gonna forcibly make that happen. Just 2 more books. And everyone else around the world already accepted that, George, this is not going to be done in 2 more books. You are the only person on earth that believes this is a reality, George. Like, come on, like this is just not feasible. So I do think it's going to have to come to a point where, and I do think that I do think there was truth in yesterday's news where Shawn Speakman probably did hear from an editor that, the editors and publishers are currently in talks with George R. R. Martin about splitting the book, about, hey, we've got maybe almost enough pages to the point where we could theoretically have a book split happen here. I do think there is some truth to that. And if that is the case, I think that, that pushback from the editors and the publishers towards George, where they're trying to convince him to split the book, will only get stronger and stronger with each passing year. So, let's say 2028, 2029, let's say we get to that point, 4 or 5 years down the line.
Boy,
Oh yeah, if wins.
I'm gonna be 30 by the time this book comes out. 30.
Oh man,
I
dude,
started watching Game of Thrones when I was like 14, something around there.
that's like more than half your life by that point. Oh my gosh. Oh, so I think if it gets to that point where it's 28, 28, 2029, and we still don't have a Winds of Winter book, the publishers and editors are just going to be like, nope, enough is enough, George. This is it. Whatever you got, just give it to us. Split the rest, put the rest to a part 2, a Winds of Winter part 2, or, whatever other title you want to come up with that's not the Winds of Winter. This is the Winds of Winter we're going to give the people. You've had enough. That's it. And I think we will see a split book at some point down the line. It won't be the Winds of Winter that George wanted us to initially have. It won't be the Winds of Winter that a lot of fans wanted to have, where it's going to be all the characters and it's going to solve all these questions and, prove all these theories right or wrong. It's just going to be the Winds of Winter book that moves the plot along for half the characters, and that's what we're going to get in 4 or 5 years time. And that's it.
Do
Hopefully.
you think there's, like, 4 years time, so 2028, not exactly sure when George R. R. Martin's, like, birthday is within the year, but he
Yeah.
would be, like, 80. Like,
Yeah.
4 years from now, he will be 80. Does maybe entering the 80s, maybe there's, like, just a revelation, maybe something's gotta change, maybe we gotta just, bite the bullet and split it. I mean, maybe that's a conversation that happens. There's a strong connection with when people turn into a different, when you go from, 20 to, into the 30s, there is a difference in your mindset, I feel like. But I don't know, maybe that's a possibility. I feel like we're just shooting blindly at the, the dartboard, but
Yeah. Yeah. That now that you said 4 years from now is 2020, actually, it's almost 2025. So 4 years from now would be 2029, which is pretty
you're
crazy.
right, you're right, you're right, you're right. That's some
Yeah.
bad math, bad math.
No, no, no. It's okay. It's like, oh, the 2024 is almost over. Like, what the heck? Like, 2028,
Yeah.
2029, time has flown by. These 14 years have flown by. Like, we're tired. We're starved for information. And if yesterday proved anything, it's that people are not just willing to get excited by crumbs, they're willing to get excited by dust. Like, dust
Yep.
of, speculative information that was out there in the wind and turn it into this big thing about, like, oh, Winds of Winter's almost here. So I think to your question of will George's mentality change when he turns 80? Well, first of all, I wish him the best. I truly hope that he lives as long as possible. All those people that, wish for George, talk about, demise and, how much time he's got left, forget those people, George. Like, George, we love you. We're so grateful that you wrote this series for us. Thank you so much. I hope you live a long and prosperous life. And I hope that within that long and prosperous life, you're able to publish The Winds of Winter and at least get
That
to
would
his
be
40s.
that would be great.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, if he turns 80, I could definitely see maybe some cogs in his brain kind of start turning and be like, well, if this book isn't released yet, I got to do something here soon. And, maybe he does split by then. Maybe he talks to, as we talked about in your video on Saturday, maybe he talks to a couple of his editor friends, a couple of his author proteges that can help him. They're not writing the book for him, but they can help him write the book where George is still the main writer, but they're kind of just, bouncing off ideas off of George and George is bouncing off ideas off of them. So
Yep.
we'll see. But last question, Grease. So if the Winds of Winter split were to happen, we're kind of falling under the idea that George has not really curbed his gardening tactics with the Winds of Winter and is still kind of gardening in some way. The fact that he thinks he can finish Winds of Winter in just one book and turns out that it's probably going to be two books. Do you think that gardening will continue? And if so, how many books do you feasibly seeing A Song of Ice and Fire ending at? 8 books? 9 books? 10 books?
Okay, well, see, there's 2 questions here. Well, one, I don't think we're getting another book after if we even got a split of Winds of Winter, I don't know if we would see a part 2. I think part 1 might be the last bit we get. So, in terms of how many books would it take to complete, who knows? Because I don't think we'll see the end of it, unfortunately. But if in a theoretical world, like, say, somebody else took over or George or we had another COVID, God forbid, or something like that, um, I think I think he can still wrap it up in 8,
Okay.
but I could easily see it being 9.
Okay.
I would be around 8 to 9. Um, I just think that George has written a certain way through all of the books that I just don't see how he's going to take things that he wants to write about and then just completely just not do anything with them.
Yeah.
I mean, you just think about individual plot lines and so many things going on within that individual plot line. It has to have you assume some conclusion or something to them, right? You know, one plot line that me and you talked about together was the Euron plot line, Samwell's plot line. There's, Euron, the character. We still have to figure out who he is as a character. We have very little information on him. We have very little time with him. How is that going to go down with Samwell and Aaron's POVs? What is his connection to magical stuff? What is the Faceless Men's duty, or what are they doing in Old Town, right? What is this possible character of Jaqen that kills Pate in Feast for Crows doing? What is Sam going to find at Old Town? Is there something to this Grand Maester conspiracy we're going to find out more from that Marwyn the Mage introduced? There's just like, think about what I just talked about. That's one plot line, and within that one plot line, it has at least 5 different subplots that need to be addressed. If you want to add in the Leighton Hightower, what are the Hightowers up to? Okay, there's another. Well, like, and that is not just a Samwell Euron problem. That's a problem for almost every plot line in this book. Like, if you look at the North, I mean, there's like 30 characters in the North that they themselves are important characters that you have to have some sort of resolution towards. And we're not even close to being a united North yet. Like, it's not even, there.
Yeah.
So I think the problem is, and I think it's the biggest criticism of both Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons, is George decided to, instead of really forwarding the plot and really getting us into the end game of the series, he decided to take it, to step back. This is going to be more character journey focused, character development focused, and not so much on the plot. And that has kind of led us to a situation where we have this gigantic, huge story that has to be condensed down into really only like 4 plot lines. Like,
Yeah.
realistically, you have to get, John having his whole faction with the North, Riverlands of the Vale. You have to have everything in Essos combine into Daenerys, and then Daenerys' plot coming over. You're going to have a Young Griff faction, and then you're going to have like a Euron type faction with possibly Cersei. Those are going to be your 4 major plot lines. How do you do that? How do you condense
Yeah.
everything down?
And then
And we
eventually
saw
the
how the show
others.
tried. Yeah, the others as well. So, and it's not only do you have to condense all those plot lines together, you then have to take those 4 plot lines and then have those 4 plot lines, work together. Daenerys and Jon and whatever Young Griff's going to be part of that. So it's a tough question. I think, I think 7 is definitely a dream by George. I don't think that's going to happen. But what do you think, JC?
Nice pun there. It's like, oh, 7 is definitely a
Yeah.
dream.
Yeah.
um, yeah, unfortunately, realistically speaking, if we do get a wind split, I think the Winds of Winter Part 1 is all we're going to see. Part 2, I think by this point it's just a dream, and a dream of spring is definitely a dream. And then, even if he were to get out, Winds of Winter Part 2, I can definitely see a situation where George is like, all right, the dream of spring is definitely just going to be one book. And then everyone already knows, like, all right, like we've already splintered Winds into 2. You're probably going to splinter, dream
Yep.
into like 3 or 4 parts. I don't know, just something crazy. There's way too many plot lines. As you said, Grease, there's 30 characters in the North. Lady Barbary Dustin, I knew nothing about her before Dance of Dragons, but now I know something about her. And it's like, all right, well, now we got to figure out what she's going to do in the Winds of Winter, if she's even going to play a role at the Battle of Winterfell. If,
We love Barbary Dustin. She better have a conclusion, George.
yeah, she better. She's pretty great, actually. Yeah, like I'm happy
Yep.
that we have all these new characters. I'm happy that we had this character driven story. That we had this introspective story, but at the same time, this also impeded George from finishing this series in just 7 books. So
Yep.
had George, let's say at the end of A Storm of Swords, if George were to have written A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons in the style of the first 3 books, where we have this condensed narrative, you still have some world building,
Yes.
but the predominant forces within the next couple of books are still, the Starks, the Lannisters, Daenerys, and maybe add 1 or 2 more characters, and that's it. I think we could have gotten the series done in 7 books, but as is, with the amount of gardening that he's done, introducing all these new plot lines, these new characters, Gerald Dane, Darkstar, Quentin Martell, just all these other characters.
We hate.
We're not Quentin's biggest fans. This unfortunately has caused the story to balloon so much to a point that, yeah, 7 books flew out the window a long time ago. I just don't see it being done in 7 or 8. I think maybe 9, 10, with the help of his friends. I don't know. It's crazy.
I even think like this wouldn't be a problem. Like, we wouldn't be talking about Feast for Crows and Dance the way we are if George had written these books when he was 30.
Yeah.
because then you'd have so much more time. You would think to finish this whole series. That would give him way more time. But the fact that he did write these when he was later in life, he didn't come to fame and all that until later in life. It just makes it where to get through this whole story, you needed it to be more like the first three, which the first three have the perfect mix of plot. We're going to get from this point to this point by the end of the book, building up of our characters, all of those things, right? Jamie has one of the best character arcs, and a lot of that happens in Storm and Swords, but Storm and Swords is the book where you get through probably the most amount of plot in terms of big reveals, things have been foreshadowed from the first two books. Storm and Swords does, it's one of the reasons why it's I think most people's favorite book in the series, because it does combine a lot of those elements really well and puts a nice little bow on the first, stage of A Song of Ice and Fire, I would say. Whereas the next two books don't necessarily do that well. They don't have the best mixture of moving the plot forward and character development and world building and all these things. It's not as nicely and neatly done as it is in the first three.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And it gets even a little bit sadder when you think that actually, when you take a look at George R. R. Martin's original idea that this was supposed to be a trilogy, the first part of that trilogy, book one of that trilogy, was just supposed to be the War of the Five Kings. That took 3 books. The second book in that alleged trilogy was supposed to be Daenerys making her way to Westeros. We're 2 books past Act One, which is the first 3 books. We're 5 books in, and we still haven't gotten to what the second book in that original trilogy was supposed to be about, Daenerys' arrival into Westeros. So, there's been so much, even from the very beginning, even though I love those first 3 books, and they're, as you said, the most condensed, the most focused, a lot of casual fans look to the first 3 as being the best 3 books in the series. There was still some amount of expansion that George did not initially
Yep.
plan for that happened within those first 3 books. So taking that into consideration, George R. R. Martin has always been bad at predicting how many books it would take for him to finish something, and it's always been more than what he initially thought. So now it's, he's like, oh, it's definitely going to be 7. It's going to be more than 7, and then he'll probably promise like, all right, it's 8, and then it probably theoretically would have to be more than 8. So yeah, oh boy,
I'd love to know what drugs George was on that he thought he could do the whole War of the Five Kings in one book. There's
yeah.
no shot. How? Like, it's just like the book would have to be, for one, massive, and two, like you would just not be able to have this downtime at the beginning of the book where like let's introduce all the no, like we've got to be just like Ned's dead in the first 2 chapters he's in, and then the war breaks out, and then like I don't even know how he thought that was going to work. That and then Daenerys comes over in book two. It's like, man, we must have had a huge gap between book one and book two.
See, George R. R. Martin was ahead of the curve. What D&D invented fast traveling in Game of Thrones season 7 and seasons 8. George R. R. Martin was already like, I'm going to be ahead of the curve. I'm going to invent fast travel in my books. Oh, Daenerys
That's
just
right.
pops here in Westeros.
He's
Oh,
just here, guys. Don't worry about it. With
yeah,
what
yeah.
army? I don't know, but
Yeah, no, it's true.
that's wild to think about.
Yeah, how, like, feasibly, how would you be able to fit, Ned Stark's execution, the Battle of Blackwater Bay, the Red Wedding, the Purple Wedding, all these things, these amazing things, and then concentrate them in just one book. I'm like, I mean, he could do it, but it would not be satisfying in the slightest because you'd just be like,
No.
all right, Ned Stark's here. All right, he's dead. Oh, Rob Stark's here. Now he's dead. It's like, all right, well, hmm.
Did you like think about how many characters would die in the first book? Like they wouldn't even be characters at that point. They'd just be like, oh, another guy died. Oh well.
Yeah, yeah. So crazy.
I even wonder like how did he plan to have Daenerys come over in book two? Was he planning just maybe Drogo doesn't die and so the Dothraki just stay with Daenerys and like I just don't see a way that she has any type of army outside of that in book one to then in book two, she has this she's coming over to Westeros and it having any type of relevance at all.
Yeah, I don't know, man. Only George knows. But Greece, I think that's all the things I wanted to talk to you about today. Greece, where can we find your channel? Obviously at the Grease Goblins, but what else you got going on? What
Yep.
what what videos you got coming up here in the future?
Well, by the time this goes out, I'm assuming my 25 days of Winds of Winter will be over. But if you do want to look at some Winds of Winter predictions, cope. You know, you just need some Winds of Winter stuff. I've been uploading for 25 days on that, so that's been interesting. But going into the new year, doing a reread of Clash of Kings, doing some other interesting things. I have this is my George R.R. Martin project. I've been doing a series that's like top 100 Song of Ice and Fire characters, and it's basically a character analysis of everyone. That one's going to be done in like 4 to 5 years. Like, just
Where's
but,
Quentin Martell on
yeah.
that list?
Oh, okay.
We'll have to
Shocker, he's
see.
not on it. Oh yeah. I should have said he's not. He might be in the top 10, guys. Just keep holding out.
Well, I'm excited. I'm excited, man. But that's great. I'm excited to see the rest of your Clash of Kings reread. Excited to see all the other things that you've got planned for this 25 Days of Winds of Winter. I'm very curious to see what your year 2025 is going to look like, year 4 of your Winds of Winter, because it seems like we're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel here for more Song of Ice and Fire stuff.
It took me a while to figure out what I was going to do for year 3.
Oh, man.
But yeah, thank you for having me on the channel. It was great, being on the channel once again and all that.
Of course. Link to the Grease Goblins channel will be down in the comments section down below, guys. And with that, I will say, please let me know what your guys' thoughts are on should you think Winds of Winter should be split. Definitely let me know down in the comments section down below. Definitely give this video a like. Go to Grease's channel, give all his videos likes. Show him some of that YouTube algorithm love. We all love that algorithm love. And thank you guys so very much again.
And if you're not subscribed, Winds of Winter is not coming out. So you better subscribe.
It's pendant on you guys. So if we don't see the Winds of Winter in 2025, that's because you guys didn't subscribe. So
that's right. 100%. Gaslight them.
Until next time, guys. See ya.